At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on April 29, 1945, a Brazilian medical officer named Captain Ricardo Mendes stood in an empty soccer field in northern Italy and received a message that made his stomach drop. 182 German soldiers were coming, all of them wounded, all of them his responsibility, and his entire medical staff had been awake for 36 hours straight. This is the story of a night when exhaustion, chaos, and the sudden weight of enemy lives nearly broke an underrated Brazilian unit that had spent months learning how to save their own men, but never prepared for the moment when compassion would become as dangerous as combat. By dawn, the ground would be soaked, the air would smell like infection and paper bandages, and a Brazilian sub-lieutenant would stand holding a single banana, delivering a message that would reveal something about fear no tactical manual ever mentioned. What happened in that field wasn't heroism. It was something far more fragile and far more human. Captain Ricardo Mendes had joined the Brazilian Expeditionary Force as a volunteer. He was a young military doctor from Rio de Janeiro, trained in the old French model of war: static lines, horse-drawn ambulances, cautious movement. But by the time he boarded the troopship General Mays in 1944, everything had changed. The Americans had arrived with a new doctrine: speed, mechanization, motorized evacuation. The wounded didn't wait in trenches anymore. They were grabbed, loaded, and raced backward through a chain of posts and hospitals before shock could kill them. Mendes and 7 other Brazilian medical officers were selected to learn this system at a specialized training center in Rio. They studied American medical crates numbered 1, 2, 4, 60, each one packed with instruments they'd never seen: morphine in preloaded syringes, plasma in glass bottles, sulfa powder in paper envelopes, and penicillin, a drug so new it felt like science fiction. They trained with canvas litters, collapsible surgical tents, and ambulances that could drive 60 kilometers an hour on broken roads. But nothing in their training prepared them for what exhaustion would do to the mind. When the first echelon of the FEB landed in Naples in July 1944, Mendes was assigned to command the 1st Triage Platoon of the division's health battalion. His job was simple in theory: receive the wounded from forward battalion aid stations, assess their injuries, stabilize them, and send them either to the division's mobile surgical hospital or farther back to the American evacuation network. In practice, it meant standing at the edge of chaos and deciding who lived first. The battalion was broken into pieces. The 2nd Evacuation Company and the 2nd Triage Platoon went forward with the 6th Infantry Regiment in the first wave. The rest followed in the 2nd echelon. For months they moved through the Serchio Valley, then into the Apennine Mountains, supporting attacks on fortified German positions in terrain that turned every advance into a slow, frozen crawl. Mendes worked in towns with names like Porreta Terme and Lizano in Belvedere. He slept in Italian houses with blown-out windows. He watched his men wrap their boots in newspaper to fight trench foot. He treated Brazilian soldiers for frostbite, shrapnel wounds, and something the Americans called combat fatigue, a kind of psychological collapse that made men stare at walls and stop responding to orders. But the Germans, those were different. When a German prisoner arrived at the triage post, he received the same morphine, the same plasma, the same careful hands. Mendes made sure of it. War was war, but medicine was medicine. Still, it was always one at a time. Never more than that, never a flood. The winter of 1944 was brutal. The FEB spent weeks trapped in frozen positions, trading artillery fire with German units dug into the high ground. Snow filled the foxholes. Soldiers fashioned crude insulation from rabbit pelts and straw. The cold was so severe that even standing still became a kind of combat. Mendes's triage post moved constantly, following the infantry as they pushed north. Montese, Castelo, Belvedere. Each objective was a mountain, each mountain a fortress. On February 21, 1945, the Brazilians finally took Monte Castelo after weeks of failed assaults. Mendes heard the artillery barrage from kilometers away. He later saw photographs of the summit, cratered, smoking, unrecognizable. It looked like a volcano had erupted. At Montese in mid-April, the intensity doubled. The American V Corps attached a 30-vehicle ambulance company to support the FEB during the assault. Mendes's triage post was set up in a building near Pistoia, ready to handle the expected flow of casualties. But no one expected 500. When the attack began, wounded men poured down from the mountain in waves. The ambulances ran non-stop. Mendes and his medics worked without pause. Morphine, sulfanilamide, plasma, tourniquets, chest seals, splints. The operating table was a continuous rotation of torn flesh and shattered bone. At one point, the ambulance company couldn't keep up. Captain Elias Cardoso, the commander of the division's triage company, made a decision that broke every regulation. He ordered 2.5-ton cargo trucks to be loaded with 18 stretchers each and sent them down the winding mountain road to Pistoia in the dark. It worked. The post didn't collapse, but Mendes barely slept for 3 days. By the time Montese fell, he had stopped counting faces. There were too many. The mind couldn't hold them all. And then came the pursuit. In late April, the German line finally broke. The Fifth Army and the British Eighth Army launched a coordinated offensive that shattered the Gothic Line and sent the Wehrmacht into a chaotic retreat toward the Po River Valley. The FEB was ordered north at speed. Mendes's triage post packed up and moved in a convoy of trucks and jeeps, racing through liberated towns where Italian civilians lined the streets waving flags and throwing flowers. The mood was electric. The war felt like it was ending. On April 28th, the triage post set up in a small town near Fornovo di Taro, just south of the Po River. The weather had finally warmed. The sky was clear. Mendes's men pitched their medical tents on the edge of a soccer field and prepared for light duty. Maybe a few wounded stragglers, maybe some vehicle accidents. That night, exhausted, they collapsed onto their stretchers and slept. At midnight, Mendes woke to the beam of a flashlight in his face. A voice said his name. He blinked, disoriented. Standing over him was Lieutenant Colonel Gilberto Fontana, the division's chief medical officer, a man who rarely left his command post. Mendes sat up. "Sir?" Fontana's face was grim. "You don't know, do you?" "Know what?" 800 wounded Germans are coming." Mendes stared at him. 800. He did the math instantly. His platoon had 20 men, maybe 30 stretchers, 2 surgical tents, 3 evacuation trucks. The American ambulance company was already stretched thin, supporting the forward regiments. 800 wounded men would bury them. Fontana said, "Get your men up. Start expanding the post. They'll be here by morning." Mendes nodded, but inside, something cracked. No one slept after that. Mendes and his medics worked through the night, setting up additional tents, organizing medical crates, laying out rows of stretchers on the grass. They borrowed tarps from the engineers. They requisitioned extra plasma from the division's supply depot. They prepared for a catastrophe. But morning came, then noon, then mid-afternoon, and nothing arrived. Mendes started to wonder if the report had been wrong. Maybe the number was exaggerated. Maybe the column had been diverted. Maybe the Germans had simply died on the road. At 3 p.m., the first truck appeared, then another, then a convoy. German soldiers, dirty, bandaged, silent, were unloaded onto the grass in groups of 10, 20, 30. They kept coming. Truck after truck. Most could walk. Some were carried. A few were unconscious. Mendes counted as they arrived. Not 800, 182. Still, it was the largest single mass of wounded enemy soldiers his platoon had ever faced. And something was wrong. The smell hit him first. Infection. The German medics hadn't had penicillin. They hadn't had sulfa. Their bandages were made of crepe paper, already soaked through with pus and dried blood. Wounds that should have been clean were suppurating. Fractures that should have been stabilized were swollen and discolored. Mendes moved through the rows, pulling back bandages, assessing damage. Some of these men had been wounded days ago, maybe a week. This wasn't triage, this was salvage. He called his medics together and gave the order. "We treat everyone. Start with the worst cases. Work fast. Don't stop." For the next 6 hours, the field became an assembly line of suffering. Mendes's men cut away paper bandages and replaced them with gauze. They cleaned wounds with iodine and packed them with sulfa powder. They administered morphine, plasma, and penicillin, drugs the Germans hadn't seen in months. They splinted broken limbs. They stitched lacerations. They worked in silence, moving from stretcher to stretcher, their hands steady even as their minds blurred with fatigue. The Germans watched them with something close to disbelief. One young soldier, maybe 19, grabbed Mendes's wrist as he finished dressing a shrapnel wound in his thigh. The boy's eyes were wet. He whispered something in German that Mendes didn't understand, but he understood the tone. Gratitude. At 7 p.m., a sub-lieutenant from the supply section approached Mendes. His name was Sub-Lieutenant Alves. He was holding a single banana. He said, "Captain, the men won't eat." Mendes frowned. "What?" "Dinner's ready. But the men, our men, they won't touch it. They want to give their rations to the prisoners." Mendes stared at him. Alves continued, his voice quiet. "They found out the Germans haven't eaten since yesterday, maybe longer. So they said..." He paused. "They said they'd rather go hungry." Mendes felt something break open inside his chest. He had spent the entire war watching men kill each other. He had seen soldiers weep over dead friends. He had seen rage, vengeance, cruelty. He had seen men refuse to carry enemy wounded. He had seen prisoners spat on, kicked, ignored. But this was different. His men, exhausted beyond thought, had chosen to feed their enemies before themselves. Mendes looked across the field at his medics, still working in the fading light, bent over German soldiers, cleaning wounds, whispering reassurances in broken Italian. He turned back to Alves. "Find the quartermaster. Get more food. Enough for everyone." Alves nodded and left. By midnight, both groups had eaten. The Brazilian medics sat on the grass beside the stretchers, sharing cigarettes with the Germans who could still speak. They didn't share a language, but they shared exhaustion and relief, and something closer to brotherhood than anyone had expected. Mendes walked through the rows one last time before sleeping. He stopped beside a German officer, a lieutenant, maybe 30 years old, with a bandaged shoulder and a face carved by too many winters. The German looked up at him and said in broken Portuguese, "Thank you." Mendes nodded. He didn't know what else to say. On April 29, 1945, the 148th German Infantry Division formally surrendered to Brazilian forces near Fornovo di Taro. It was one of the last major surrenders of the Italian campaign. Captain Ricardo Mendes and his triage platoon treated 182 enemy wounded in a single afternoon. Not one of them died under Brazilian care. The event was barely recorded in official histories. No medals were awarded for it. No photographs were taken. But the men who were there, both Brazilian and German, carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Years later, when asked about the moment, Mendes would say only this: "Our men gave their food to the enemy, not because they were told to, because they chose to. That is what war taught me. Not how to kill, but what remains when the killing stops." Fear had brought them to that field. Exhaustion had broken their bodies. But something else, something older than doctrine, older than nations, had held them together. The ground had been soaked. Not with blood, but with something rarer. Mercy, born from exhaustion so deep that hate had no room left to live.